Okay, we're going to look at a point here, and a point by geometry definition here has no size. In other words, it's infinitely small. I know sometimes we draw a point with a little marker here, but just realize here that it actually has no size at all. Pardon me, when we draw a point here, it'll basically just look like a dot. But realize those dots are fictitious, it's just for our eyes. They are actually infinitely small. In order to name a point, you always name it with a capital letter. It could be A, B, C, D, F, G. You got 26 to choose from, but it's always a capital letter. It's never lowercase. Okay, so just by standard notation, it's always a capital letter. And the coordinate notation of a point, the coordinate notation of a point will always be an x and a y. In other words, it'll always look like x comma y. In this case, I have several points here where the x term for point D would be negative 11 and the y is 6. In other words, it goes 11 over to the left and up by 6. And you get other points here like point C, which is 0, 0. That would be at the origin. Or B, which is 3, 3, meaning 3 to the right, 3 up. And so just be aware of the notations there and how those ones look. The second thing on here is looking at the differences between a line, array, and a segment. Of course, when you get a bunch of points put together, they can make up one of these three. Just be aware here that a line, by definition, extends infinitely in both directions. In other words, it goes up in this direction forever, and it goes down in this direction forever. That's what the arrows mean. We can call this line BE. When you do label it and the naming of it, you can either name it with like an M, an italicized M here, lowercase one, lowercase m, we can just call it line M, or we can call it line BE. You could also call this line EB. Okay, it would make no difference. It means the same thing. In other words, EB is the same as line BE. They make no difference. Okay, in terms of the naming, you can switch the lettering around. In fact, if I put another letter here and I just called this point C, you could call this also line EC. You can also call this line CB, or you could call it line BC. There's many combinations here depending on the number of letters. As long as you choose two letters from that line, it indicates the entire line. So it doesn't matter which two you choose. And again, you can label it with 2 points or just with one lowercase italicized letter. For array starts at a certain point. We call that the end point. And it never ends. So like a line, it goes on forever, only though in one direction. That separates it from a line. So, and to name it though, there is a little bit, it's a little bit more tricky here because you have to know the endpoint is A. And so to name this line, I can call it ray AC. Now I can either write here ray AC, okay, and that actually says the same thing, or I can indicate that it's a ray by putting the little arrow above it, okay, the little arrow. Now notice before a line at a two-sided arrow, in this case it's a one-sided arrow, and it always points to the right regardless of what direction it's going in. In other words, I would never write it like this and say, well, that's ray AC. That's totally incorrect. It's always to the right. You always have to name the first letter the endpoint, though, and that is a change from naming lines. Because if you look at lines here, I could call this line BE. I could have called it EB. It makes no difference. Here, I have to call it ray AC if I'm talking about this being the endpoint and going on forever. In other words, I can't call it this. Ray CA is incorrect because while it may start here, this does not end, or it ends. It doesn't go on forever, pardon me. So it goes on forever. So in this case, you couldn't call it that. Now the last thing here is called a segment. Segments, let's go over here. They do have a finite starting point and a finite endpoint. Again, you can name it using the endpoints. In this case, I could have called it FH. I could have called it HF. It's exactly the same segment because they start and end, pardon me, they start and end at the exact same point. So I could have called it HF. Notice that my bar above doesn't have arrows because they're not going on infinitely, unlike array or unlike a line. It's just a bar. And I could call it FH or HF. Suppose I just want to talk about this segment right here. That's okay. I could have called that FG, or GAF. It'd make the same thing. I can also, again, call it a lowercase letter, just like the other ones, maybe T or as array, I could have called it P or M. Doesn't matter what letter you choose, but make sure that when you're labeling it, it has those things. Just be aware in terms of basic naming things for these segments. The last thing here is just talking about collinear or linear. Just be aware here that collinear means all in the same line. Now you may not actually see the line like it's represented here, but of course A, F, and C, and D are all in the same line. They're all what are called collinear. Obviously A, F, and B are non-collinear, okay, or not collinear, because they're not all in the same line. And so you can look at these ones, and I give several examples of collinear and linear, but just realize all it means is that they're all in the same line.